So we had really interesting sessions this morning of what's happening in the field, and we wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive. And this session is about cultivating performance management culture. So my name is Rafi. I'm from the Grassroots Business Fund. We also have here Brad from Acumen Fund and David Bonbright from Keystone Accountability. So this past year, we actually rolled out a customer satisfaction survey, which actually last year, David talked about rolling out and doing a cohort survey. So since then, we've actually done a survey with our investees, so what we call our grassroots business organizations, or small and growing businesses, as ANDE calls them. So we're going to take you through the process and actually show you some of the data. And we thought it'd be more exciting to show you the data that we didn't do too well on, just so you can see what we've done with it. So pass it off to Brad to start.
The slide master.
Yeah, you can do it. You can try.
I trust you with this far more than myself. So first, one, just talk real quick about kind of what the process is. What did we actually do? At Acumen Fund, we ran our a survey last summer, kind of July, August timeframe. Kind of the results ran into the fall. GBF did one before us, and so for us, we were able to kind of leverage the survey that they had built. We went through kind of a couple iterations. Internally, just so making sure the questions were sort of appropriate for ourselves. The survey covers 6 general areas: general perceptions of Acumen Fund or the fund that you're working with, due diligence, financial support, non-financial and technical support, interaction and communication, and social impact. So within those 6 areas, we had on average 4 or 5 questions, along with sort of the ability for investees to give us open-ended questions. And then after that, there's kind of a custom section where you can kind of add in a few questions that are sort of relevant to something that's going on at your fund. The surveys were administered by Keystone. We never got any of the direct results, so there was 100% anonymity, which was really important to us. It was really important to kind of convey this to our investees so that they would feel confident, kind of not just telling us what they thought we wanted to hear, but giving us real constructive feedback that we can make some good changes with. David and his team that kind of analyzed all the results can send it back to us along with kind of the raw data, so we can do some kind of slicing and dicing. Again, it was all anonymous, but we can kind of say, how does our India office do versus other organizations or other sectors? Kind of doing different kinds of analyses where does it vary by kind of the age of our investees, our newer or older investees, giving us kind of different types of answers, and how are we kind of progressing in that manner. What it's really useful for is when this data serves as a starting point for us to actually learn some things that we can improve on and have kind of the internal dialogue across our portfolio team on things that we can start to do and improve on over the course of the next year. So what we want to do is, as we get into the next year of the survey, when we start doing it, start building trends across our portfolios. Feedback that we got, we weren't doing so great in X, Y, Z area. Are we starting to see improvements based on some of the things that we're doing? So again, the last point here is the results. Then this is kind of a 360 feedback loop for us. Is that how do we then go back and share it with our investees? And I'll get into a little bit more detail, but we just had our investee gathering in Nairobi just last month. So kind of telling them exactly what everyone said, kind of in aggregate, and what we're doing to improve on, and how we can kind of go on and increase the communication between our investees and what they're telling us.
And we actually have several of our SGBs here in the audience today. So we actually have 2 days after this workshop where we're having some additional training with them that Harold mentioned. And one of the sessions that we're going to be talking about is actually showing them back the data, at the aggregate. What did everyone say about GBF, and what can we improve on?
So on the next slide, the format that we're going to get to once the clicker fixes this, we're going to talk about some of the results of our data. And I could bore you with a whole lot of stats about why GBF and Acumen Fund did awesome, but I'm guessing right after lunch that's not that interesting. So we're going to go ahead and take off these rose-colored glasses and talk a little bit more about what's most interesting to us. I mean, the things that we didn't perform as well on, that's what we're actually going to spend our time internally, as Acumen Fund's portfolio team talking about. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So in the spirit of transparency, we're going to say, what we didn't do so great on. If you do want to talk about, why we're awesome, you can find us during the happy hour, and we're happy to go back and talk about all those data points. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about the things we focused on. The 4 areas that, it was interesting, I actually did my slides, and Rafi did his slides kind of separately, and what we were finding when we were sort of looking at each other is that there were some themes, some common themes of some areas that pulled up. And I had 4 areas, Rafi had a 5th, but those 4 areas were almost exactly the same. So what we're going to do in this format is kind of, I'm going to talk a little bit about Acumen Fund, he's going to talk about GBF, and even though it's just a data set of 2, being able to benchmark ourselves against each other is really cool and useful. And David's going to talk a little bit after we're done with our respective results about how he kind of sees this progressing. So the 4 areas that came up for Acumen Fund was general perceptions. I'll dive into these a little bit more detail, but the understanding of Acumen's portfolio team of the on-the-ground realities and the content expertise, better understanding there. In due diligence, there was a decent amount of confusion across the portfolio of our investees as to exactly what were the kind of requirements and what's the timeline. So there's going to be a common theme here. Communication is a big theme. So a lot of these things are things that we should be better on. We think we might be doing well, but we can obviously not doing well enough. Non-financial support is the 3rd area. So we kind of just broadly call this management support. This takes a lot of different forms at Acumen Fund and GBF, but we were hearing that our investees weren't seeing enough of it or enough benefit from it. And then the 4th and final area that we're going to talk about is social impact. This is an area that Acumen Fund we feel internally we spend a lot of time on, and we were hearing from our investees that we can be doing a lot better job. So how are we using the data? What are we doing with the data that we're getting from them? And ensuring that we're having, again, communication with them about why we're asking for that data and how, not just how the investees can do better on their social impact, but how we can do better and have shared learning across ourselves with our investees.
So we'll start off with general perceptions. So
I get to go first again, right?
Yep.
I think I'm talking a lot. In my area, I kind of have this format here, kind of what our goal is, what the data said, and kind of open-ended direct quotes from some of our investees, which we don't know who they are because it's anonymous, and then kind of what we're doing about it. So in the area of general perceptions, what we were hearing was we had a lot of expertise on kind of the investment side, kind of the financial performance, doing the due diligence, which makes sense. A lot of the people on our portfolio team that we've hired kind of come from an investing background or a consulting background. But the area that our investees were telling us we didn't do a good enough job on, and 25% of our investees were saying they had concerns about our expertise and effectiveness. And this was in particular about the content area. So, doing due diligence on a water investment, making sure that we had expertise to understand the business models to kind of supplement the financial expertise. The 11% was a number that's a relatively small number, but it stood out to me in reviewing our results. Felt that our understanding of kind of the context of how they're operating their business, kind of on the ground expertise, wasn't high enough. So even though this is a small number, this is a big area for us to think about. And if you kind of read through the quotes, it kind of that sort of reflected there. So the kind of what we're doing about it, I think as we have our kind of hiring and thinking about training of our staff, it's really important to say we don't just need people who have investment expertise, but have lived in the field or have content expertise. And so that can be done kind of recruiting, making sure that we supplement that. We can bring in people who have content expertise but maybe don't have as much financial or investment expertise, and kind of let them train on that instead of always sort of focusing on training on the content area. And then making sure that we're, put for example, kind of Water World Week, making sure that our investment teams are getting the content expertise so that when the portfolio team is doing the due diligence on the next water investment, they don't have to spend as much time kind of getting ramped up in understanding of the issues of that type of business.
So I put here some of the questions we actually had for the survey. So the question was, how well does GBF understand your organization's strategy and the unique content in which you work? So this is what the data said, and here's some quote. And what's really interesting is we did 2 surveys, one in 2009, which we actually showed some of the data here at the ANDE workshop, and then we actually just refreshed it 2 weeks ago. So this is brand new data that our clients just filled out. And what we saw last year, we actually did the survey before a lot of our disbursements went out. And the data actually was really good. Hey, you're doing a great job, and yeah, keep up the good work. And then we got this time after we dispersed a lot of the money, and not as as good as a response. But we're actually really glad that all of our clients were very honest with the response, and we're actually having more conversation with them later this week of, what were the issues with this. So some of the quotes that you'll see down there, direct support from GBF staff was amazing. More staff time would have been better in the future. So a couple of them said, hey, it's great that GBF comes, once every now and then, but it would be great if you guys can come every quarter or earlier than that. So that's one of the things that came up. And the other one is all the officers on the ground are really nice. In our case, I think it should be a place we work and then try to understand our problems that sometimes are difficult to explain. So later on, we asked actually other questions about how often do you have interactions with GBF staff. So some of them, it was actually exciting how often they have an interaction. Even some of them, a lot of them said on a weekly basis. But for those that didn't, they wanted more touch points with our investment officers. So general perceptions.
Due diligence process. The second area for Acumen Fund that stood out was a lot of confusion around the due diligence process. In kind of looking at the data, I think it stood out very obviously why this was coming up to me. Kind of the first point, how long did due diligence take? You would expect, somewhat of a standard process here, but we were finding just the data was kind of scattered throughout a whole range, and 36% less than 6 months, but a quarter of the people took more than a year, right? So this is a huge range, and so it's pretty obvious why there was confusion on the part of our investees. The second point, which I think is probably as, if not more so, important, was that of the people who felt that it took too long, which is about a third of our investees, almost half of them felt there were the delays on our part. So I think this speaks to the point that Acumen Fund can be doing a much better job, early on, just communicating. Again, kind of what is the standard process here, and when there are delays, making sure that our portfolio teams are making sure that the investees know what's going on, what's happening kind of along the process. I think this point was somewhat related to the general perceptions point. Kind of the quote that I put up there was the investees were feeling a lot like the delays were from kind of the lack of understanding of the business model. So again, the context of what these investees are doing, because we had the financials and skills, but not necessarily the knowledge of the content areas, is kind of getting ramped up and understanding the business model work, and therefore causing delays in the due diligence process. So again, some of the stuff that we're doing about this, a big focus this year on kind of communication with our portfolio, ensuring upfront that they know what the process is, and then kind of the example of this newly drafted investment letter that I referenced is kind of just trying to document exactly what the process is going to be. In the past, it hasn't been very well documented and therefore not very well communicated. So just getting it down on paper, it's a relatively easy, straightforward thing to do, but we're always starting to see that this is helping with the process, a lot of communicating in advance to our potential investees what's going on.
Just a question. Did you find that did you look for the most recent investees feeling like you've taken the longest time, whereas the ones you've done earlier, they've forgotten how long it takes? So was there anything along those lines you measured?
Yeah, there's a little bit, actually. I think you could probably speak to this as well some, but yeah, when we sliced it by that, we started slicing too much. You start, we have an investment portfolio of 35 investees. We got about 80% response rate, so we had 28, I think, was the number of respondees. You start slicing it too much, it gets hard to do analysis, which I might be ringing your bell of the cohort again, but yeah, there were some trends there that the newer ones felt like there was more delays. Hard to know what's kind of statistically significant versus what's, an outlier kind of point.
Mm-hmm. Trying to get this thing to work. Okay. For ours, it was how clearly did GBF explain its application due diligence process, the timeline for making its investment decision. So what's actually interesting is we asked the same exact question in 2009 and 2010. 2009, we had 6 clients that filled this out. And in 2010, we had 18 that filled it out. So what was interesting to see was in 2009, it was clearly explained, but this year it hasn't, and that's definitely, we can see why, because we actually have grown a lot in the past year. So we've had a lot of new investment officers that have joined the team. So it could be that maybe we haven't explained to our investment officers the exact timeline, or explained that conversations should be very clear with our investees. So that was one thing that came up. One thing that we have done this past year is actually develop a timeline for our investment officers so they know exactly what to expect, and they actually have that conversation early on in due diligence with our clients, and we actually share that timeline with them and say, okay, this is all the stuff that we're going to be covering in the next, what was that, anywhere for 4 to 6 months, and to actually prepare a list of documents that they should also have prepared or should think about throughout the due diligence process. So one of the quotes that came up was, the entire due diligence process was more open and friendly, comfort level was high, importance were given on the gray area with a lot of suggestions for improvement. So that's definitely something great to hear. But like I said, there were a lot of issues of making sure that the documents were actually, that GBF wanted those documents, and it wasn't broken up into a bunch of little emails saying, hey, we need this, and hey, we need that, because it was actually, these organizations were actually trying to run a business, so bugging them with 15,000 emails saying, hey, we need this additional document gets a little annoying after a while. So that's where we came up with a whole checklist of all the documents that they need to make it easier on them. We also came up with an investment criteria checklist. So we said, okay, does it make sense for us to invest in this organization? So instead of wasting their time and our time, we knew from the get-go if it actually made sense, if it fit with GBF for this investment. So those are 2 documents that developed over the past year. For financial support, one of the questions that we had, which was actually interesting, to what extent did GBF's financial investment enable you to strengthen your business and achieve social outcomes? So here's the results. 4 is neutral, and we were actually kind of surprised that we actually were ranked a little low on this, because we thought the investment that we would give to them would actually really help them achieve their financial and social impact. So it was interesting to see that that wasn't the case, and then when we sliced the data, we saw some interesting reasons why. And we'll actually talk about that in the non-financial section, where we also value technical assistance. We feel like we do a lot of it, and then we actually heard that we actually didn't too well on TA. So one thing that they did say is, rather than doing so much debt investment, maybe you should consider doing equity investment. So some of them actually said the structure wasn't the most in their favor as well. So here's non-financial.
Non-financial. So non-financial support is kind of the broad umbrella, which at Acumen Fund includes everything from our fellows program to kind of pairing investees up with either short-term or long-term consultants, experts in the field. And one of the surprising things that we saw is kind of that first bullet point, which was a majority of our investees weren't really seeing any improvement from the technical assistance, right? And so this is, a big value proposition in our mind. So this kind of stood out and kind of had a lot of conversation internally about why was this and what did this mean? Should we just scrap this completely? Looking at some of the other data, it became clear that no, we shouldn't scrap it, because a lot of our investees were asking for things, so that we needed to hear what they were asking for and make sure, kind of as the second point, that more people were receiving it and receiving what they needed and wanted. One of the areas there was another question on exactly what people wanted, which I didn't quite have room for, but I think the quotes sort of illuminate is that investees were looking for some kind of more shared learning across from each other. There's a lot, our portfolio has kind of very disparate businesses. There's a lot of learning, kind of setting up of basic processes, HR management, fundraising, a lot of things that are kind of common denominators, which, portfolio of 30, 35 investments, we don't need to kind of keep them separate, but let's learn together. So a couple of things that we've done at Acumen Fund to try to get better in this over the new year. Recently hired a person to focus on performance management. She's in New York now, getting training, then she's moving to our India office. So she's going to be full-time focusing on performance management, matching of management assistance with portfolio. The second thing I mentioned earlier was our portfolio gathering. So majority of our investees came to Nairobi for several days just last month, and this was in large part to promote shared learning, kind of getting our investees together, and there were field visits to a number of our investments in Kenya. But in advance of the investee gathering, we also added a couple of custom questions to our survey, which I mentioned at the beginning. So after the kind of standard questions, there's sort of this section of what else you want to ask people. So we asked, first it was logistical stuff like, would you come if we did an investee gathering? And if so, what kind of stuff do you want to learn about, and kind of just highlight all the appropriate ones. And that's what we kind of geared, that was kind of last fall until this May. So we had a nice long runway to kind of put together programs and bring experts over. So our director of HR came from New York and to the investment gathering, and he's kind of spoke just all about HR and hiring. There were sessions on fundraising, so it was really just a great opportunity to hear from the investees what they wanted, and then when they were all together to start kind of gearing everything that we were doing towards kind of meeting those needs. So hopefully next year when we do this, more than half of our investees are actually getting technical assistance and, more importantly, benefiting from it.
Go ahead.
Stephanie.
Yeah, hi, Brad, quick question. Stephanie from the Nike Foundation. We actually did a similar process within the foundation of our grantees, and this came up as a key issue, that our grantees wanted more connections to each other and more of an opportunity to dialogue. And I'm just curious whether you found, do people tend to want these gatherings, let's say like once a year, or was there any conversation around like an online platform for them to, meet and discuss common issues?
Yeah, I think both. I mean, So the question was for our investee gathering, was there's sort of an appetite for having something like that? If so, like once a year, or was there kind of an appetite for kind of ongoing learning in some sort of online platform? We've thought about the online platform and how we can do it. We haven't done that yet. I think the kind of first was, let's bring everyone together and see if people will come, and if they're willing to invest a week of their time of coming, and what are they going to get out of it. And it was tremendous, the gathering, and I think there's a lot of excitement and energy, both of the portfolio team at Acumen Fund as well as kind of the investees. So I think it's something we're going to definitely keep doing, and think about how can we keep that going kind of between this year and next year, keep that dialogue open.
Yeah, for us, we actually bring all of our clients in. So we have a handful of them here right now. So like I said, 2 days, or following this workshop, we have 2 days of actually speaking exactly about technical assistance, because one of the questions that we asked was, how much has GBS technical assistance improved your capability to perform the following functions? And the functions were operational efficiency, market access, governance, IT, MIS implementations, social metrics, and this is the aggregate of it, and they're actually saying only 63% are saying some improvement. And like Brad said, this was something that we thought we did a really good job on, and it's actually turning out that 11% are seeing no improvements. And one thing that we've been doing because of this is bringing them here, right, to have these conversations and for them to meet each other, right, and also to learn and spend time actually doing TA, because one thing that we realized, it's really hard for them also to run their business and also do the TA. So we try as much as we can to put, for example, either a GBF investment officer will stay for an extended period of time to train them on whatever TA they need, but also we implant MBAs for an extended period of time to help them actually roll out the TA that they need. But one thing that we've noticed is that governance and business readiness is definitely something that is needed, and they don't have that right now. So hence one of the reasons why we have this workshop. So one of the suggestions were to actually do this operational efficiency, market access, corporate governance, and ITMIS implementation. So we actually brought on someone specifically for ITMIS implementation for investee organizations. So some of them are going to be rolling that out this next year.
In the last area that Rafi and I are going to talk about is social impact. This is another area that at Acumen Fund, like technical assistance, that we think we put a large amount of focus on it, which we do. We've talked a lot about Pulse, and Pulse is something that we've spent a lot of time and effort on. But what we heard from our investees was that a majority of them, about half, didn't know how we were using the data that they were supplying. It was an interesting kind of two questions. The first question, which we didn't talk about on this slide, it was kind of a positive thing, was do people feel like the data requirements are reasonable? And for the most part, everybody did. They were comfortable with the amount of data and what types of metrics we were asking for. The problem was, once they submitted it, didn't know what was happening with the data and how are we using that to impact. And the kind of the second point shows why, because about a third basically said they don't know how we responded to their last report. And this is something that should be relatively standard procedure, right? You get a report and talk with the investees about it to promote shared learning. So again, in very small numbers, 11% seems to keep coming up a lot. 11% only felt that there was significant shared learning. So even that should be the point of social impact, right? It's not just gather data, fill in some data fields and pulse and be done with it. This should be something that we can do better on. Again, communicating, making sure that we're responding to reports and having conversations about them so that we share learning. It's not just the data comes to us. And this should be what Pulse is used for. Internally, it enables our portfolio managers to kind of aggregate their data and pull reports very easily and use that to kind of facilitate having the conversation. So it needs to make sure that it's not just a one-way flow of data, but rather that it's kind of a loop, and the data leads to conversations, which leads to shared learning. So for us, this has been a big renewed focus in 2010, which I'm very excited that the FX team is kind of taking on being the role of the Pulse manager, because it means my time as the Pulse manager is being freed up to do the portfolio performance management of Acumen's portfolio, and that we're getting the reports and, more importantly, doing something useful with the data.
Yeah. And for GBF, what was really surprising is how did GBF respond to your last report? 17% that we did a really good job at responding to the reports. One of the quotes that we had, are actually 60% of the clients stated that we only responded to the reports. And we were actually just having a conversation earlier with several of our investees before the session, and we totally forgot that the documents, kind of like what Acumen has, that we actually use in our investment meetings, or just our what we call our chief investment officer meetings on reviewing the portfolio of the company. We have this project scorecard, which is basically our dashboard of everything that's happening in the organization, all the good things, all the bad things. It's financial projections, it's TA, and we've never shared that with our clients. And then after looking at this result, we said, why don't we share that with them? Why shouldn't we share that with them? And it made us realize if we're using it to make decisions on how well the organization is doing, why shouldn't the organization also have that same information that we're basing our decision how well they're doing on? So now we're going to be start to circulate that document back to our investees. And actually, it just came up, we do a social return on investment calculation, and it was more just of an in-house calculation that we do on our investees to see what is the social impact they'll be generating. And we just had this conversation, and they're seeing in their fact sheets, yeah, your SRI is $12, it's $13, or whatever it is, and they haven't actually seen how the SRI has been calculated for them, which is definitely something that we need to improve on. But without this data, I don't think we would have realized that. And now that that's come to forward, that we have these conversations after this workshop, that we can actually show them and sit down and say, this is what we're actually looking at for your organization. This is what we think you need to improve on. And also, this is what we're comparing you against, because we actually have a portfolio report and also what we call our impact dashboard, where we say for all of our ag businesses, this is the average SROI for that sector. This is the number of farmers on average for each one of the investments. We look at the amount paid to those farmers. So now that if we share in that document, they can actually two things. One, compare how well their organization's doing with the rest of our portfolio. And number two, and we were talking about this earlier, about verification, making sure that GBF is actually reporting the number of farmers and the amount paid to the artisans or farmers or what have you is actually accurate. Because this is the document that we use for our board and our external communications. So it's actually a little verification, a little check, and making sure that we're reporting the right numbers. So. And then, how well do you understand what GBF is doing with the information you report? So this was also really surprising. So they sent us the report, and it just went into a black hole. And we were having this conversation, what did you actually do with it? And they had no idea that there was an actual project scorecard, that there was an impact dashboard. And they didn't even know that GBF is part of the IRIS taxonomy and that we're going to be inputting the data into the GEAR system. And a lot of this is new for them, and we're actually really glad that they're here so they actually know what is happening in the field, and to show them that this is what is actually happening with your data. It's going into the bigger field. So what do we have on that? So what's one thing that we added is we did something called the double loop survey. So we did surveys, and the results that you saw was between GBF and our investees, our clients. How well is GBF doing? What can we be doing better? So we also do what we call progress out of poverty surveys and also customer satisfaction surveys between our investees and the actual end beneficiaries. So if this is GBF, then here are our investee organizations, where some of them are actually here in the audience. And then those organizations actually work with the artisans, the farmers, the borrowers, the end users, and consumers. So the second loop of the survey that we help design with our organizations is between the labor nets, the honey cares, the LACCOs, and the actual end users. So what's actually really interesting, got caught off on the top, but here's some of the results we actually just collected in regards to customer satisfaction between, say, LACCO and its farmers. So we went out there, we trained LACCO's staff on how to execute a survey, how to actually aggregate it, and then we helped them do the analysis. It turned out that 87% of farmers are interested in obtaining organic certification, but only 10 are currently certified. So LACCO had no idea that this was such a high percentage, and that they didn't even know how many farmers wanted more training. So now that they have this data, they can actually either go to other investors and donors and say, hey, my farmers want organic certification. They want more training. Is there any way that you can provide additional capital to help us do this? Another one of our organizations, LaborNet, they found out that 41% of the people surveyed had an interest in accessing loan to finance purchasing tools. So LaborNet is, in essence, a temp agency that basically places workers, mostly construction, on job sites, but also offers them a bunch of other services. So one of the issues that LaborNet saw is that, yeah, all these people want to go on the job site, but they don't have the right tools, and they don't have the access to the capital for it. Well, they found out through the survey that they want to get loans so they can get these tools, and now LaborNet is actually partnered with an MFI to actually now offer loans to these workers. Another one is HI. This is actually a really interesting organization. So they export cocoa from rural Tanzania, and they export it to mostly Germany, but a bunch of other places. So what they realized from the survey is 97% of the farmers said that the reason why they sell to other organizations in that area is because they offer second payments. So second payments in the agricultural is, first, HI will pay them for the amount of kilo that they bring in that day, but sometimes the price of the cocoa will fluctuate, so other organizations then put a second payment. They offer a second payment. So HI realized that they weren't doing this, and because of the survey results, they actually now have started to offer second payments. Another thing that they actually found out was also about tools, that a lot of them needed pruning shears, but didn't have the capital to buy a pruning shear. So now, from the survey that they collected and asked, hey, do you want pruning shears? Are you willing to pay for it? How much would you be willing to pay for it? Do you want to rent it? They're now offering or renting pruning shears to their farmers. And then the last one was Selfino, which is, that's HI, and this is Selfino. So Selfina was actually, it's an access to finance organization in Tanzania, and it actually asked on its survey, what kind of services would you be interested in addition to having access to a loan? What kind of services would you want, and how much would you be willing to pay for it? So we were able to graph on a chart, and this is responses directly from the borrowers, how much or what is the biggest demand for a service, which it actually turned out to be savings accounts and credit insurance, and on average, how much would you be willing to pay for this? So this is Selfina's market study on how much they should be charging their clients for it, and without doing the survey, none of these organizations, I would say, would be able to know this data, or it would be very hard for them to collect it. So the idea is for customer satisfaction is not only between GBF and its investees, but also doing it with our investee organization and then the end borrowers or the end beneficiaries, so they can actually collect data that is actually meaningful for the organizations and that they can actually do something with it. So 88% of GBF's investees said collecting social impact metrics has allowed them to better understand, improve, and conduct products and services offered. So that's a high percentage that they actually really value the social impact data, but it wasn't until they really did the surveys did they really see the benefit of doing it. So, David, go ahead.
Maybe before, we should just pause for a second. We're halfway through and take some questions.
Sure.
I just think, I'm sure there are some. Suzanne.
Hello. I have two questions towards the methodology of this double loop survey. First thing is, like, what kind of questions did you ask towards the beneficiaries? Because how do you find out about needs that are probably not voiced? So how do you come up with what is missing there? And the second one is, how do you get to the beneficiaries in terms of language, and how do you make sure that they understand what you mean is what they really understand?
Right.
Because you cannot go there with English and ask, how is it going, you know?
Of course. So we actually we work with our investee organizations to actually execute the surveys. One thing to tell you guys is GBF does not execute these surveys. It's our investee organizations that do. So we'll send a student team, or we'll go out to the field and work with the investee organization. And actually one of our organizations today, LATCO, we actually did that this past January with them, where we sent a student team and a GBF representative and developed a survey that was customized for that organization. So we do a progress out of poverty survey where we actually try to determine, hey, are people actually progressing out of poverty, right? That's why we're all here. At the end of the day is the stuff that we do, people are actually progressing out of poverty. So GBF wants to measure that. And the investee organization should also be interested in measuring that. But while we're out there also doing this survey, let's also collect customer satisfaction data. So for customer satisfaction, we don't come up with those indicators. We have an idea because we've done it with other organizations. But that's a conversation that we have with our investee organization, saying what kind of data do you actually want to know from your clients, right? We had no idea that that High was going to find out that pruning shears was going to be an issue for some of them. So they asked, hey, are you willing to pay for pruning shears? How much are you willing to pay? We also had about competitors. It was actually really interesting on the High survey that we asked them, how much cocoa do you grow? How much do you sell that cocoa to High? Who are the other competitors? And they actually told us who the other competitors were, and they told us, why are you selling to those other competitors? And one of the reasons was because of the second payments, and then High was able to do that. So as for the language, it's translated into the local language. So in the case of Tanzania, it was Swahili. So we'll work with an investee organization to actually translate the language, train them on how to execute and administer the survey, and we even give them the data aggregator tool that they can simply input the data in an Excel tool and it aggregates, and they can see the basic results. And then we have access to that information as well, where we'll do further correlation and do a deeper dive and say, okay, this is what's happening in region A with those farmers and versus region B. So does that answer your question?
Any other kind of quick questions? We'll also have a chance to ask questions at the end. I'm not going to speak for half an hour, but any other burning questions that came out of this? Okay, so I'll segue in. So first couple things. I'm going to do a slight transgression of client privilege here, and I think I'll be forgiven for it. But I just wanted to underscore that both these guys have really emphasized the negative, and I think that's a great gift to all of us. Most of the data was extremely positive. In fact, that's the general problem with these kinds of surveys, where there's a power dynamic in the relationship and a dependency. It tends to be more positive, and I think they're able to read between the lines, and they've done that. And but there also was some good critical feedback that they've shared with you. So Really, they've made originally in this presentation, we'd said I was going to go first and kind of set the scene with a big framework, much in the way I did at this conference last year, and talked about the role of feedback loops and how they can strengthen performance and outcomes. But when I saw their presentation, I realized it was unnecessary in a way for me to do that because, as they say in the law, the thing speaks for itself. So really, I have very little to add except more, please. More of this. This is it. You just heard some great stories about low cost, light touch, data gathering that has led to significant changes in performance, which hopefully will lead to outcomes. And we should measure that, by the way, to see if these metrics and this approach does lead to improved outcomes. It's a hypothesis we should test. But this is great. And again and again and again, as we were looking at their data, we kept saying, gee, I wonder what this really means. We don't really have a norm around this. And what if we had 40 or 50 different data points of investors and feedback from them? We would know whether an average 5.3 on the kind of clarity of our communications on our due diligence model means. Is it good, bad, or indifferent? So this is the first important reason why we want to move from individually surveying our stakeholders, which I'm sure we all do. It's standard practice now that people are surveying their stakeholders and trying to eke value from it, as in the way that Rafi and Brad are. But if we move to a common tool across our stakeholders, and particularly our immediate clients, customers, constituents, we can then have some norms for the field, some benchmarks. And we heard this morning a lot about the value of benchmarks and operational and impact kind of data. We can also get it in the feedback space. And so that's really the first benefit from moving to a comparative approach on this. And I just should say that we are now at Keystone marketing a survey that's based on the questionnaire. It is essentially the questionnaire that we've built together, the three of us, over the last 2 years. And so we think we have a fantastic questionnaire, and we're out there recruiting. So this is a kind of shameless marketing plea that any social investor in the room that might like to do this, now's the time. We'd like to run it over the next couple of months. So we're actively recruiting. And let me tell you more about why we hope you'll join us in this. So there's obviously norming for the field. Secondly, it kind of turbocharges peer-to-peer learning. And if you think about all the things we've been talking about today, when we get much more granular data about the value of communicating clearly on this or that, or a tool that's been developed to enable investees to better understand what you're trying to do with the data and so on, that's very granular and an easy thing to then learn and share and spread. So it's just about getting granular and then having real detail around which we can learn and raise the field together. Thirdly, and maybe the most important, it builds credibility for the field as a whole. So if you, as a field of social investment, are out there establishing norms, not only are you defining your terms in the same way using a taxonomy and beginning to develop a rating model, you're also actually putting out and publishing feedback about your performance. This will make you really stand out in terms of the broader marketplace of actors that are trying to create social change. Really builds the credibility of the field, and therefore can be used in your fundraising efforts. I think this will become contagious in the sense that once Acumen and GBF started to share this data with their funders, these are the same funders that others are approaching. Those funders are going to turn around and say to the next person who comes along, how are you doing on your feedback scores on this and that? This question really interested me. Where are you on that one? So in a way, it's going to become a necessity once it starts. And let's do it together. Let's build that new framework. And lastly, and I'll say more about this in a minute, it supports the other field-level data infrastructure, and specifically the taxonomy and the data management platform and the rating model. Okay, before I move on, I just want to say one more point on this first slide, which is this is relatively, I said, light touch and easy to do, but it requires a lot of effort on many parts, and it's not impossible. And we have a great, big, huge analog out there in the world, in the business world for this, which is the customer satisfaction industry. And I said this last year, but it's worth saying again because it's such a great story. I think we are at where the customer satisfaction industry was in 1963. So in 1963, if we were all together in this room, and we were all the same age we are now, none of us would have filled out a customer satisfaction form. And kind of 47 years later, here we are, and we do this on a constant basis, and everything's different in the world because of the extent to which companies have learned to listen to customers. Well, customer isn't quite the right concept for us. We're in social change. We use the term constituent, and we talk about constituency voice. So it's a slightly different concept than satisfaction, but it's actually the same set of measurement gestures and tools. And we can take those gestures and tools and we can apply them to really understand what the people who are meant to benefit from our work directly and indirectly further down the chain think about that work, and that helps us improve. And you've just heard two great narratives about what that can be, what happens when you do that seriously. Okay, yeah. So, I'm just going to quickly kind of go over and go on to the next one, the process for the survey that we're doing now. This mirrors the slide that Brad talked through earlier on an individual organization survey. It just you can put them all up. I'll run through them quickly. It just expands it to cover a cohort. So we put people agree to join the survey. We put a straw man questionnaire on the table, which is actually a very strong questionnaire because we've now really worked on it hard for a couple of years. And I have some here. I'm happy to share it with anyone who wants to look at it. And again, everybody, and we work on it together, and we tweak it further and get it to where you want it to be. Then each investor can add up to 5 custom questions. Brad explained what they did with their custom kind of unique questions around their investee gathering. So that's unique data that you get back that doesn't compare with anybody else's. You then inform your investees that the survey's coming and why you're doing it and what you hope will come out of it so that they really have a context around the survey. It's critically important. We then send out the survey to everyone and they understand they're filling it in anonymously. We collect the data, analyze it, and put it together in a report which we share with each of the investors. It's a confidential report. The investor is the only one that gets their data. Everyone else gets data where the other investor's data has been anonymized and only theirs is identified. So that's how it works. And we also give you the raw data set, which has been completely anonymized. So you can do further analysis on it than what we do. And there's a lot more to be mined in the data than what we can do in the way that we've priced this, which is why we give you the data so you can work it further. Then you review the findings, and these are the steps really that Brad and Rafi outlined. Analyze them, discuss them internally, and go back to decide an improvement plan. Go back to your investees and kind of say, we asked you, you told us, this is what we heard, this is what we propose to do, what do you think about that? Which is kind of a critically important step. And then finally, you implement those improvement plans, and in 12 months you repeat. And that's part of the point, is that it's a permanent process, a continual process of learning and improvement that we're embarking on. Okay, in addition to the, next slide please, to the individual confidential report, this is just to give an example of what you kind of graphics we're using to convey in these reports. And there's a lot of data that's buried in that very simple looking graphic. I just want to explain it so you can kind of see the dimensions to this. The colors on the dials basically say poor, satisfactory, and good on some objective scale that we've developed through focus groups and conversations with people filling out the data. These are indexes of a number of questions that have been aggregated to get to this score. The dotted lines break up the entire survey into 3 groups. The far left is the bottom 25%. The middle slice is the middle 50%. And then the right slice is the top 25%. And we also can put into these the highest performers and the lowest performers with dots so that you can see the range of responses. And the dial itself, the needle, is the actual score of one investor. So that's one investor's score. So that's where they set. So in this case, I like the non-financial one is interesting. This is from a survey that we did in East Africa of grantees of local grant-making institutions. And one of the big headlines from that was that absolutely everybody was not doing well on their non-financial support, somewhat similar to the data here around technical assistance. And this is a kind of a consistent finding that we're seeing in a lot of our surveys, that this is an area where everyone needs to really focus on. And that just comes out loud and clear there, where even the top quartile are still in the red zone for the most part. On the left here, this is the application process. That particular foundation was doing wonderfully on their application process. They were in the top quartile and near the excellent standard. Okay, next slide. So that's the private report. We also produce a public report, which is entirely anonymized, which then helps establish the field level legitimacy and sets the norms for the field. And this is an example of the report that we did on the East African survey. It's on our website. There's a few public reports there from different surveys that we've done that you can look at and see what these products are like. But it's, and so that's what that looks like. Okay, I'm just going to run through some questions that come up a lot as I talk to people about the survey. And I'll run through it pretty quickly because I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. So the first question is, what does the survey cover? And I think Brad spoke to the different areas of the survey, but flip to the next one. Basically, it looks at the basic characteristics of the investees, so we can slice and dice that as finely as you want so that we can then do cross-tabulations later on the basis of younger investments, older investments, size of investee, field and subfield, and so on. The application due diligence process, the investment structure, non-financial support, communications and interactions, the relationship overall, if you will, reporting requirements, and the general perceptions and knowledge, and influence. And we also take these answers, something we've done since the work with GBF and Acumen, and we've put them together to develop 5 indices that we think are powerful public ways to represent this emerging field. And those are efficiency. How efficient is the investor in supporting this organization? It's a bunch of operational stuff, how long due diligence takes, and so on. Learning. How does the investor enable you to learn? How good is it the investor enable your learning and improvement? Net value add. What is the net value add coming from the investor beyond the finance for the most part, but including the financial piece? Credibility. This is the index that's not so much looking at performance, but looking at your reputation. How credible is this investor in the world in your eyes? Is by being associated with them, is that good for you beyond the actual relationship itself? And finally, their overall satisfaction in terms of the relationship, where we're trying to get to some kind of net promoter score type data. Okay. So one question that comes up a lot, and we heard it this morning actually in the context of IRIS and GEARS, which is, what about the huge heterogeneity, the diversity in the field? And how valid really are these comparisons going to be across widely varied organizations, and indeed across diverse cultures, where in one country people might answer very differently the same set of questions, even in the same relationships. If you could hypothesize 2 exact same relationships in Kenya and Thailand, you can imagine some pretty different answers on the basis of just cultural norms. And the answer is, the comparisons are really as valid as the differences in those societies. You can't completely, at the level of methodology that we're going to employ, we can't eliminate a lot of that variation. But in fact, the point of this is not to get to a scientific and precise measure of exactly what's happening, but rather to point out where there are issues. And that then enables you to go in and actually find out. So you might read the Thai data very differently from the way you're going to read the Kenya data. And you'll learn to know that over time, in part by comparing the two and seeing that, because you know you're the same organization. How are we getting these different answers? So that's really the answer there. And there's obviously a lot more that can be said about that. Then there's the comparisons against each other. So we're different. The social investment field is young. The social investing model is young. Everybody has a different model. There's different degrees of subsidy that are built into the financial components. There's a grant component. Some have, some don't. And where are you on that impact first, finance first scale? All that stuff. So how can we compare on that? Well, the answer is that we will be very careful in the first set of questions to be able to identify those different dimensions of your model so that we can cross-tab and analyze the data on the basis of those. So this is a way to actually understand those differences and bring them out and analyze them. And maybe together start to learn more rapidly about what's the most effective way to do social investing. So the next question is about internal benchmarking. Some funds are quite large and have very diverse kinds of funds that are working in different areas and are interested in doing internal benchmarking but are wondering about the validity of that. And also early stage versus late stage or investments. Rafi talked about a hypothesis of theirs about a dramatic change in responses after a year, in part because of the different stage in the cycle of the investment. And again, the answer is let's slice and dice it. Let's actually understand that and learn from it over time rather than just shooting in the dark. Let's get some data that starts to pick these things out and then study them over time and get lots of participants so that we have a good data set to work with. Okay. Okay, so what's a big enough sample size? The answer to this is that you can always learn something by talking with and engaging with and learning from your investees, no matter how many you have, even if you have one. But from the point of view of a survey that's based on the principle of anonymity, the sample size has to be big enough so that you can actually maintain the anonymity. And you can literally, I've done it. I've done surveys of 4 or 5 where I've sat down and I can figure out who's who because I know the community well enough and I can figure it out. So we figure the numbers around 5 or 6, 7 that you want to have before you can really have an anonymous survey. If you want to be part of a survey like this and you have fewer than that, it's still possible, but you need to go to your investees and say this is going to be non-anonymous, and if you want to, we'll do it, and if you don't, we won't. So there's a way to get around it. It's just basically to lift the veil of anonymity. And that's doable, especially with a small group where it's pretty intimate. But it's a different exercise. Next one. So I'm hearing this a lot, and that is, it's not a question, it's kind of a moan. And it's so true. Everybody is running absolutely flat out, and now kind of Keystone comes along and says you got to do this too, and there is no easy answer to this. I can say 2 things. The first is that we really make it easy at the front end, and the second is it's really great what happens when you do it. And I hope that Rafi and Brad have really demonstrated that, so it's not just me up here blowing smoke about that. And that's really my kind of evidence of it. It's just, once you've got the data, you can't ignore it. And all of a sudden you find the bandwidth because you really see that you can do stuff with it and it's powerful. Okay. So this last question is really building on actually there's 2 more. This last question builds on the last one, which is, but it's more specialized. It's not about my organization, my fund's bandwidth, but I don't want to burden my investees. And Steve teed it up this morning when he talked about data as burden. And my answer is exactly the same answer that Steve gave. If this survey is seen as and experienced as a burden by your investees, you've already lost. But if we can present it to them in a way that makes them that they understand from the very beginning, this is worth the 50 minutes I'm going to spend answering this survey for all these reasons. It's not a burden, it's a catalyst. And again, I hope that Rafi and Brad's presentation is an example of what that's likely to lead to. If you go to the next slide. So I have 2 questions that I like to include in all of our surveys in some form or another, which speak directly to this. The first one is, how useful have you found this survey? And we recommend to people, when they get the survey, we recommend very strongly that one person doesn't fill it out. The temptation is for the chief operating officer or someone like that to fill out the survey because they have the most contact with the investor. But actually, if we say get everybody in the room who relates to the investor and then do it together, and what happens is it becomes a really cool learning experience for the fund, for the investee. And we can see that very clearly in the answers to this question. It correlates absolutely, it's 3 points higher on a 1 to 7 scale between those that fill it out individually and those that fill it out as a group. So we really push this. It's very valuable, and it begins preparing them for when you go back and say, this is what we heard. That's the first. The second is, how likely do you think it is, this is the cynic's question, how likely do you think it is that the investor is going to make any real changes or improve because of your feedback to this survey? And I like to watch this number over time, because if you follow up on year 1 and really take the survey seriously, and they see that, guess what happens in year 2? It is something that people look forward to. They eagerly fill out, the response rates go up, and they see that this is actually something they've invested in and therefore we will invest in. And so this is the key point here, which is that it's about a relationship. It's not about the data. It's about what Brad and Rafi were emphasizing, having the dialogue, going back to people. The data is a catalyst. Okay, last question. So this is the kind of $1 million question for today, because we've been talking about data infrastructure all morning. So how does this relate to Pulse, Iris, and Gears? I hope that it's kind of self-evident at this point, but I'll just quickly say that if you've got a reporting standard and you've got a management platform for information and you've got a rating model, then if you have a regular way, a standardized way to get feedback from your investees, you can use that to actually feed in to that existing infrastructure and support it. So, for example, we will use the IRIS taxonomy to define, for organizations to self-define in the beginning questions of the questionnaire, where you say what areas you work in and so on, so that there's coherence between the two, and this will then create data that can immediately correlate to the IRIS taxonomy, and so on. So that's the first way, is that you can get data that actually feeds directly in. We'll go for that optimal coherence, because we do want to get the synergies here. The second is that we can use the survey for analysis and insight about the process of using better data and having better data infrastructure and better measurement. And what do I mean by that? Well, so we ask a question in the survey: where do you locate yourself on the spectrum of evidence of impact, with 1 being anecdotal only and 7 being extremely rigorous evidence that no reasonable person would doubt that we've caused this change? Okay? And so having that time series data around where people are self-locating on that spectrum can be very useful for understanding the role of the other infrastructure pieces, for example. The second question that we ask is, do you know, the one Rafi talked about, do you know what the investor's doing with your data, right? So here's a way to find out, to the extent to which they're aware of the infrastructure and using the infrastructure, like IRIS or Gears. And here's a good one. Do you get enough funding to do this metrics work that you're being asked to do? And again, we can tie that specifically. We can get as granular as we like with respect to the emerging infrastructure pieces. So we can kind of get real pulse, if you will, kind of real-time pulse of what's going on in terms of how the investees are feeling, how resourced they are to do all this. And you can also ask a question about, are you getting the technical support that you need? Okay, so I think you see the idea. The third, okay, well that's I guess that's the first thing I want to say about that. The next slide. So this isn't my my candidate for the kind of killer graphic that Margot's looking for, but it is how I see the world of measurement. Okay, I'm just about done. So one, and that is that basically what we've been measuring historically to varying degrees of success are performance and results. And basically what we are saying is we all know that at the heart of sustainable social value creation are human relationships and institutional relationships, and that they're the real driver of what gets done. And we aren't measuring that. And so if we start to measure that more carefully, it can feed into the measures that we have for performance and results. So you can start this cycle anywhere you want, but if you measure your relationships and then let that become a way in which you understand your performance and your results, then that improves the quality of the evidence that you have of both. That evidence goes back to your relationships, and then people will then tell you how that's going. And you start to create a virtual cycle of improving the quality of your measurements as well as the quality of your work. And so I like to say that the dashboard of the future should have this third dial on it that we haven't always had, which is the relationships dial, and we can measure that using comparative feedback surveys. Okay, so that's pretty much all I wanted to say, except one last quick slide. I can't resist. There's a great report that came out last year on shared metrics. A lot of you probably saw it, that FSG, Social Impact Advisors, did. And it really, I think it's a really important study where they did it, and this is the key, the heart of the study, which is this framework about what are the dimensions, what are the aspects of shared metrics. And there are three. First, shared measurement and comparative performance. And you heard all about that today. That's what IRIS and GEARS and Pulse are enabling in this space. And then there's a third category, which is adaptive learning. And this is where those first two land in discourse amongst the actors in the shared metrics, and improvement in learning happen. And that's what we're trying to add with comparative feedback surveys. And the way we tune the feedback surveys is to strengthen the first two, and the three together then make the total picture of a kind of comprehensive shared measurement framework. That's it. Sorry, we kind of went a little too long on the presentations, but you got it all now.
Thank you.